when I first got graduated, I just tried to continue making paintings in the studio that I had, which was essentially a bedroom. And I slept with my work. I just, I had already kind of uh, figured out what I wanted to do. And then I got this phone call from Paul George's to come to New York. And the job that he had for me was a painter you may have heard of. His name was Greg Botts. Greg Botts was living in this church on 42nd Street at 2nd Avenue. And he was essentially the janitor or the caretaker of the building. And he was going to go to the Hamptons for the summer. I was to take over his space. So I showed up. I walked from the Port Authority bus terminal. I walked over, rang the doorbell. He comes down. I told him Paul sent me. He says, "Yeah, come on in." He shows me around real quickly. Says, "These are the keys. This works this, and this. This is what you have to do. You have to make sure this is done, that's done." And he says, "So let's go out." So we went to Times Square and we got wasted drunk and went to I mean, Times Square was a really seedy place at that time. And for me, I had never seen anything like it. So we spent some time there and then we crashed at his place. And in the morning, he left and he never came back. And so I was just there. And at first, I was like just kind of living in Greg's world. And then it suddenly turned into my world. And my wife came up to live with me. And because up until then, she was still living in Philadelphia because she had a job at University of Pennsylvania as she was a secretary to the head of neurosurgery there. So she did his papers and things like that, did publishing and all that. So she came up to New York and uh, I just had this job where I just had to be in the building. They loved me because I never went out. I just stayed in there painting all day long. And I did a few things that I had to do. So I stayed there for 2.5 years. And my paintings took on a kind of urban quality. But what I was doing, I ended up, my work evolved into painting swimming pools from aerial perspective, from ridiculously high vantage points. And there were all these figures uh, and then uh, I had this friend from Skowhegan who had gone to Yale after Skowhegan, and he was living in Philadelphia. And I went to visit him. And my friends in New York were buying lofts in Soho. You could buy 2,000 square foot loft for $20,000 that was already livable at that time. But I didn't have $20,000. I had maybe 10,000 from saving. And so my friend was in Philadelphia and he was in these. I said, this is kind of okay. I could get something. So I ended up very naively, I bought a building on Second Street in the old city in Philadelphia. I paid $8,500 cash for an 18-story, four-story building with about almost 7,000 square feet of space. And it hadn't been lived in. It was in a part of the city that had all been German Jews from the 1890s up until the 1950s. And the last people who lived there invented American cheese in 1911, and today is Kraft cheese. But they started there, and their name was Wildenstein, and I bought that house from one of their relatives, but it hadn't been lived in for 47 years. So my wife and I moved into this building, and my work evolved there, and it became more and more textural. And I was seeing, a lot of the artists that I was interested in were painting mixed media, and I was doing that already. I had this woodcut history, and I started painting, making paintings and making woodcuts from the paintings. And then this friend of mine from Yale said to me, "Why don't you put them together?" And I thought it was a brilliant idea. And I started painting the wooden panels and carving into them and doing that. And that evolved. And suddenly my work was interesting to art dealers. And I got opportunities to have shows. And my work got bigger and more bold and more, more solid, more personal. And so I was getting invitations to do shows in California and in Chicago and getting around the country. And uh, this Mark Rosenthal, who was curator of 20th century art at the Philadelphia Museum, who had just arrived in Philadelphia, and he brought the Jonathan Borofsky show from LA. And he was one of the first people on board for Anselm Kiefer. And I had submitted my work for a jury at the Pennsylvania Academy. They had a space where you could do individual shows. So it was really good artists who had shows there, Susan Rothenberg, all kinds of good people. And so I submitted a package of slides and I got a letter from them that said, the jury found your work interesting, but not quite ready for a museum show. We think in another 2 years you'll be ready, and we invite you to resubmit. So I just threw the letter across the room with 100 others that I had gotten from other people telling me I wasn't ready. And I was in a gallery on Walnut Street in Philadelphia, and a painter by the name of John Moore, who shows at Hearst and Adler, who I knew a little casually, he said to me, he said, you know, if you have a show, you should make sure that that new guy at the Philadelphia Museum, Mark Rosenthal, gets an announcement. I said, why is that? He said, well, I was on this jury at the Academy, and he saw your work and he was absolutely sold and convinced. And he said he just couldn't convince the jury to give you a show. And I said, really? He said, yeah. So 2 months, 3 months later, I was having a show. So I sent a card to Mark Rosenthal. And the first morning of the show, he walks into the gallery, looks around the gallery. It's 10 o'clock in the morning, walks up to the desk, and he said, the Philadelphia Museum would like to reserve this painting for its collection. So the dealer calls me up. He says, this has never happened before. He said, this is amazing. You know, he said, this is really something. And I said, okay. So then when the show was over, this guy comes to my studio with a truck to pick up the painting, and he was instructed to pick up three paintings. So I gave him the one painting that they asked for, which was 4 by 8 feet. And I said, let's pick two others. So I said to the trucker, pick one. So he picks one, and then I picked the other one. And they went off to the museum, and they hung them up in the museum for months while the curators were deciding on which to keep. So I got a message that they had made a selection, and then I get a phone call from this guy who was one of the art installers at the museum, and he says, "Man, you got to come over to the museum." I said, "Why?" He says, "Your painting's on the fucking wall, man." And I said, "Really?" And so I went over to the museum, and there it was, hung across from this huge Anselm Kiefer that Rosenthal had just bought. And I was like, oh my God. And I get up really close to the painting. I'm looking at it, and the guard comes over. He says, get away from the painting. And I said, it's mine. He says, I don't give a shit. Get away from the painting. So now I'm embarrassed because I feel kind of like I'm in this, you know. So anyway, I called Mark Rosenthal on the phone, and he get on the phone. And I said, you don't know me, but you just bought one of my paintings. He says, oh, I know who you are. And he said, I said, I just wanted to thank you. And he said, look, I have no trouble with that. That's nice. Thank you for calling me. He said, it wasn't the easiest thing I've ever done, but he said, I know exactly what I wanted to do, and that was it. And I said, what do you mean it wasn't easy? He said, well, he said, you have to understand something. He said, curators are just ordinary people, and they like art that looks like other art that they already like. And he said, you don't do that. He said, you know, he said, you're a little bit like Cezanne. He doesn't give you any handle. You have to enter his work through his eyes. And he said, you don't give any handles. You have to go in your work through your eye. And he said, and until there's a critical mass around your work, he said, you're going to have a hard time. He said, but one day after that mass comes, he said, maybe it will never come, but he said, if that mass comes, all the things that curators hate about your work, they're going to love. And they're going to say it's the best qualities. So he said, that's what I know. So I said, thanks a lot. So 2 weeks later, I get a letter from the Pennsylvania Academy. We even decided to re-invite you to submit because they saw my painting at the museum. So I took exactly the same package that they had rejected and sent it back to them. And then I get a letter a week later that says the jury has agreed to give you a show at the museum. And I thought that was so funny, you know. And so anyway, I had this magnificent show in this magnificent space. And I really, I think it was Mark Rosenthal who really helped me do that, and I had a, a lot of people, 15,000 people saw the show. It was, I got okay reviews and stuff. Nothing happened beyond that. The same show went to New York. It was at Anita Shapolsky's gallery on Spring Street. And in 18 days, she sold all the paintings and they all went to Europeans. And so I was like, wow, it matters where you show and who you show with does matter. So that was that. And in that moment, this young woman who was working with Mark Rosenthal as a curatorial assistant, uh, when she saw my painting, she called me and asked me to come to my studio. And she invited me to be part of a show that she was curating in Georgetown in Washington. And I did. I sent my painting down and I went to the opening and I met her mother, who was named Sophia Imber. And I didn't know anything about her, but she was the greatest curator in South America. She liked my work. She comes over and she says, "You're the best artist my daughter found." And she found a bunch of artists, but you're the best one. And she said, "I think if you came to my country, you would find a lot of interesting things. It might be a good experience." So after my show in New York, where I sold all the work, I reached out to this woman's daughter and I said, "I'm going to take your mother's advice and I want to come to South America. So can you help me find a place to stay, etc." Now, I knew nothing. I didn't speak a word of Spanish. I knew nothing about the culture. All I knew is this woman told me it might be good for me. So I took my wife and my three children at the time, and we went down and we rented an apartment in downtown Caracas. And we moved in. We were the only people speaking English anywhere around. We didn't know anything about anything. And we stayed for about 4.5 months. And I had this powerful exchange on my fifth day there. She took me to meet a guy who was an architect who was kind of an interesting guy and had a big house and he had artists in the house working and they were going to be showing at the Venice Biennale and they were making their work and I got introduced to them. He looks at my portfolio of pictures and stuff and he stops and he pointed to a painting that I had this painting of a head that I had made wooden panels, and I cut it in half shortly before I went to South America. And I separated and I put a panel in the middle, and I just painted it black with this very thick, juicy black oil paint. And he stopped and he pointed to that painting. He says, "We are going to fill this for you." And when he said that to me, I said, this is creepy. He's onto something. So he took me through his whole house, and I looked at everything he had. He keeps handing me things. What do you think this is? Because he was kind of like a guy who was an explorer and he found things, he brought things home. So the very last room in the house, he hands me a stone. And he said, "Can you tell me what's different about this stone than any stone in the world?" So I looked at the stone and I'm thinking, I'm thinking, I'm thinking. Finally, I said, "No, I can't." And he took the stone out of my hand and he said, "It makes sound." And he shook it and an enormous calmness flew, just kind of welled over me because I realized he had taught me in a single gesture what I was missing. You can't understand things unless you immerse yourself. A child, a baby, would have figured out that stone made a noise, or you could eat it in a minute. And I was standing there not able to figure it out because I was trying to think my way through it. I had to live my way through it. I had to eat it. I had to taste it. I had to try it out. And I left him with an immense calmness. And I knew whatever was going to happen, I could get through this because I was going to let it just happen. I didn't care who made fun of me when I tried to use the language. Nothing mattered. I was going to succeed. And it began a 25-year love affair with Latin America that brought me to the rainforest, to the deserts, to the Amazon, to Colombia, to Peru, to Mexico, and I became incredibly informed by the nature in that part of the world and the passions and the mysteries of a culture that was European, just like I had come from, but a really different European sensibility, a culture that had all these mysterious beliefs. People would have plants hanging in their house and they wouldn't feed that plant because it ate the evil in the room. And it was living off the atmosphere, but they believe it was eating the evil. And so it was a magic land, and it really gave me a great contrast with that youth that I had grown up with. And then I succeeded. I showed in museums and I showed in galleries and I got written up and I had this opportunity. And that brought me to Miami because Miami is the furthest northern city in Latin America. It's the place where the weather matches the Venezuelan and Colombian climate, the language, people buy art here. They like art. And it's filled with people from various backgrounds and different experiences. It's got, it's not what I grew up with. Not, it's not the villages. It's, this wonderfully dense, interesting people with accents who speak different languages, who have different traditions, and it was a perfect fit.